The art, music, and politics one, I love that question because it's part of what I try very hard to do in my classroom, especially because a lot of my teaching is with non-majors. We have a lit requirement at TCU, so people in the business school have to take a lit course, and people who are majoring in engineering have to take a lit course. And because I teach American Lit, I get a lot of non-majors, I think, because they figure it's going to be relatively accessible, as opposed to, maybe signing up for an early Renaissance Lit where the language is going to be tougher. And one of the strategies that I do use a lot is to bring in visual, music and current events in my teaching of literature. So the general answer is I do it a lot when I'm picking which texts. I really go for accessible, and I go for visual as much as I can. So I'll give just two quick examples. I've been teaching a course on literatures of migration and diaspora. There's tons of stuff in the news about refugee groups and migration today that you can pull on. And one text that's been particularly effective for me in the classroom is to use the Hamilton mixtape video of Immigrants We Get the Job Done. There's so much to analyze there in terms of the way that visual imagery is working, in terms of the way that episodes within the video, contribute to the larger argument that's really a pro-immigrants argument. And another text that I use is the photograph of the poor little child that was trying to, whose family was trying to cross the Mediterranean, who ended up, drowned and lying in the sand, having his body having recovered. And there's many versions of many mean versions of it. So we have to take some time to think about cultural appropriation. We have to take some time to be critical of the very kind of viral circulation of that image, and the rhetoric of it circulating in these different contexts, how it should be troubling, but also, what the goal of circulating it might be, and then use that sometimes, as an entry point into teaching a text like The Circuit, which is about a migrant family. So I'm picking things that I think my students will be able to read from their contemporary knowledge of visual culture and music, which is really strong, and then use that as a way of getting into the maybe more challenging print texts, that'll be, the kind of core pieces. And I'll show you an example of it a little bit later when we go to a couple of monument-oriented texts that we're going to look at during the text sequence. With all the historical and contemporary texts available, are there resources that can guide teachers in finding and pairing works to teach in the classroom? Yes. One of the great places to look is the National Council of Teachers of English, Read, Write, Think, sources online that have full lesson plans. Those are, good examples. I also like the MLA options for teaching and approaches to teaching texts. And NCTE has a new book series on, principles of pedagogy that's coming out with new texts all the time. And that's one place to look where you may find some, some helpful resources. And then stay in touch with me. I'm happy to share my syllabi. I have syllabi on my website, and I'm, happy to share at any point. And I'm also happy to set up a time just to have a conversation about what you're doing in your own classroom. And yes, Leslie, it's free, commonlit.org. There's also quite a number of websites now around traditional authors, like the Cather website, the Whitman website, that have, and Emily Dickinson website, that NEH supported website is fabulous place to go and download material. Excerpts, yes. I mentioned the anthology that we're working on transatlantic literature. We're imagining people pairing that anthology with some whole texts. But I think a well-chosen excerpt can do really good work. And sometimes with some of these texts that I'm doing a full text at the college level, to introduce a student, to an excerpt is a wonderful way to go. So I mentioned Douglas earlier, maybe instead of reading the whole narrative of the life, you might just teach the excerpt that's the preface to the Dublin edition. Because there's a lot going on there. It's maybe 3 pages long, and you could actually spend a couple days productively just on that one text. So I've been persuaded that excerpts are really productive sometimes to use. Zachary, I love your question about pairing, canonical texts with multicultural texts, and I think we have to be explicit about avoiding stereotyping in either direction. I gave the example of pairing the Whitehead with the Jimenez, partly as an example of the benefits of avoiding setting up, here's the white text and here's the multicultural text, which sometimes works really well. But I agree with the implicit point in your question. You talk about how your students, might conclude that I Too Sing America and I Hear America Singing becomes a binary. And one of the things that's going to be beneficial about the work that we're going to do around this sort of line of multiple texts later in the week is that we're going to bring in a third text. And I think when you bring in that third text, one of the things that you do is sort of undo the binary. And we'll talk some about that this afternoon or later this morning when we talk about some of the things that I'm preparing right now to teach in the fall. I haven't taught yet, so you'll have to check back and see if it worked. So I would say yes. Be aware of the dangers of setting up a binary if you're doing white and versus multicultural, and think about maybe doing several texts instead of just two, and then also just cultivating a critical perspective. Middle school teacher question, I really want to address, partly because I'm having so many conversations with my daughter right now. She's in a school in Atlanta where they're doing a humanities approach, and so what she's got is 4 themes that she's supposed to cover. Where she's supposed to integrate the history with the thematic study of literature, and one of them is voting, which they've picked for the coming year. And she's nervous about that one, understandably. So she's going to focus on the suffrage history that we talked about a bit earlier, as well as some of the contemporary issues. And then another one that she's supposed to do is technology. And she's setting up technology in the 19th century as a kind of cultural force that shapes, literature, and then looking at how that's happening today. So I would say, capitalizing on theme is a good way to go with younger students, as opposed to trying to do, a full chronology. And in response to the question about the example of Ben Franklin, how do we introduce them to the traditional stuff, and how much do we introduce them to the traditional stuff that they don't know? Because I gave you the example of people know Franklin, and somebody who's in 6th grade probably doesn't know a whole lot of about Ben Franklin. So I think in a case like that, you do want to provide some introduction to the more familiar stuff that we know about, that we think of as familiar, that our younger students may not know. And again, I'll point to an example that we're going to do in a little bit with the textuals, with the textual studies. I really think it's useful still to introduce students to some of the canonical material, but to come at that canonical material, through different interpretive lenses than maybe we used in the past. There was a question about from Brady about how much theory, and I tend to come at theory through particular texts, as opposed to teaching theory as, directly, explicitly. I tend to weave it into the curriculum, but I do think it's helpful. And there was another question about keywords. And I think a resource text for teachers that might be handy would be Keywords in American Culture. There's a website associated with that that has a bunch of short essays online, and I don't think that 11th graders are too young to get introduced to some of that material, but it's also a good resource for you. And an example I'll give is in a gender and women's studies course that I taught last year. I used a similar text that's key concepts in gender studies, and I just sprinkled them through the course. We didn't like use the textbook as a freestanding thing. I picked particular theoretical concepts and dumped them down at moments in the class when they worked well. And I did a similar thing in a course that I taught on the history of the field of American Studies in the spring of this past year. I laid out thematic frameworks that we were going to use. And then within each of those, I had some primary texts, and then I had some keyword moments around, that fit in those thematic moments when I put the course together. First year teacher, would you suggest doing chronology? I think in your first year, you should do whatever you feel most comfortable doing. The one sort of, caveat I would give is to not feel like you have to quote unquote cover everything. Maybe you want to think about a strategy that one of my former students tried out that worked pretty well. Is she started with the most recent lit in the chronologically arranged textbook that she had, and then went back, as opposed to starting with the colonial era, which tends to be hard for students to access. But starting with the recent material, then she could go back and construct a sort of what are the things that went on in the colonial era that are still showing up in literature today, and that are still key issues for us today. Black Atlantic was absolutely influenced by other Black thinkers that preceded Gilroy's work, including the Negritude movement and the among Caribbean thinkers and Africanist and Pan-African thinkers. So, Gilroy's work's been super influential, but he was certainly influenced by, people like Memmi and Césaire and Du Bois, and you can see that in the work. And that line of thinking, I think, continues to be important. Let me see if there's anything else that I am not going to be